Future Now Show. Brought to you by the Club of Amsterdam.
I'm presently the rector of a private university group called Swiss UMEF University, headquartered in Geneva, but with campuses in Afghanistan, Iran, Armenia, Mali, and Niger, and opening in 2018 in France and Senegal. We are basically expanding. And also as another activity, I'm starting a newsletter called Future Ages, which will analyze trends, the major societal trends, and the result of these trends for industry, what kind of opportunities and what kind of threats these trends are creating for industrial organizations. So I will start maybe with recapping a little bit the history. Our direct ancestors were a migrant group. Back in 7000 BCE, before Christ, agriculture in Europe distinguished its population from that of the rest of Eurasia. Population movement and migration has existed from the various beginnings of humanity and can be considered a normal strategy in the search of better opportunities for the migrants themselves and their offspring, to escape natural catastrophes, to escape political oppression, or simply to leave areas suffering from a lasting economic downturn. The Bible, ancient Chinese scrolls, and the Mexican chronicles all relate migrations, always in search of a divinely ordained place. The Germanic tribes immigrated to parts of the Roman Empire and were instrumental in its final destruction. There was also the slave trade, with a forced departure from the countries of up to 12 million people. The Jewish migration from Spain and the Protestant countries, from Spain and the Protestants from France benefited greatly the receiving countries. Towards the end of the first millennium, there was a period of intense technological progress in Europe, even though some of the underlying know-how had originated in China. This progress was initially based on knowledge that was developed during the era when Rome dominated Europe and then was forgotten, taken up by the Muslim world, and rediscovered by Europeans. After having declined for 2 centuries, from the 6th to the 8th century, essentially due to epidemics and invasion, Europe's population grew from the 9th to the 13th century, tripling from 20 to 60 million, and then collapsing in the 13th and 14th centuries due to bubonic plague, also called the Black Death. Maritime advances contributed powerfully to the economic prosperity of Europe. What distinguished the captains, crews, and explorers of Europe was that they possessed the ships and the firepower with which to achieve their ambitions, and that they came from a political environment in which competition, risk, and entrepreneurship was prevalent. The benefits accruing from the expansion of Europe were widespread and permanent, and most important of all, they helped to accelerate an already existing dynamic. The emphasis upon the acquisition of gold, silver, precious metals, and spices, important though such valuables were, ought not to obscure the worth of the less glamorous items which flooded into Europe's ports once its sailors had breached the oceanic frontier. Access to the Newfoundland fisheries brought an apparently inexhaustible supply of food, and the Atlantic Ocean also provided the whale oil and the seal oil, vital for illumination, lubrication, and many other purposes. Sugar, indigo, tobacco, rice, furs, timber, and new plants like the potato and the maize were all to boost the total wealth and well-being of the continent. Later on, of course, there was to come the flow of grain and meat and cotton. But one does not need to anticipate the cosmopolitan world economy of the later 19th century to understand that the Portuguese and Spanish discoveries were, within decades, of great and ever-growing importance in enhancing the prosperity and power of the western portions of the continent. Bulk trades like the fisheries employed a large number of hands, both in catching and in distribution, which further boosted the market economy. And all this gave the greatest stimulus to the European shipbuilding industry, attracting around the ports of London, Bristol, Antwerp, Amsterdam, and many others a vast array of craftsmen, suppliers, dealers, insurers. The net effect was to give to a considerable proportion of Western Europe's population, and not just to the elite few, an abiding material interest in the fruits of overseas trade. The Native Americans were, to all practical purposes, exterminated by the European immigrants. It is, however, in the last 300 years, precisely in the post-Malthusian phase, that the population grew in an accelerated fashion. The 140 million that populated Europe in 1750 reached to be 266 million in 1850, while Asia's population reached 700 million. During that period, Eastern Europe's and Russia's population grew faster than that of the rest of Europe. In fact, immigration from Europe to other continents was one of the two elements, together with technology, that proved Malthus wrong. It not only decreased the European population, but it also brought new foodstuffs, such as sugar, cod, and herring, that helped nourish the population that had stayed behind. Malthus, who published his book, An Essay on the Principles of Population, in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, believed that population growth was necessarily limited due to the exhaustion of necessary limited resources, land, and hence food in particular. Population growth would reduce income and create families, and thus should be stopped. Technological development disproved this theory. In fact, it is quite possible that the pressure on resources led to technological developments that improved the use of resources and even led to the discovery of new resources. All the major scientific breakthroughs took place in Europe in the 17th century. Why this took place in the western edge of the Eurasian landmass is still an open question. Increased scientific and technological progress impact demography by creating wealth and thus allowing families to use more resources towards raising their children. Communication technologies, including the padded collar and the horseshoe, furthered growth in Europe by allowing, among others, the rapid rise in literacy and the creation of decentralized but linked networks. This made the structure extremely difficult to capture. Progress in road building and in printing technology contributed massively to the creation of these networks. With thousands of characters, the cost of storing information in Chinese prevented the country from achieving the same rapid economic growth known by Europe. As for Arabic, it suffered from a lack of standardization, which made decoding difficult. Malthus's theory also ignored the specialization that results from international trade. Finally, it ignored the fact that families behave as humans, not animals, and can voluntarily regulate the number of children they will bring to life. From 1880 to 1920, Europe's population grew from 356 million to 487 million, or on average by 3.27 million per year. The growth was even faster in the urban areas, as there was population inflow from the countryside. Thus, from 1875 to 1925, the population of London grew by 80%, that of Paris more than doubled, and Vienna's trebled from 1880 to 1910. Thus, while Europe's population was smaller than that of either China or India in 1500, and the Asia population will represent 60% of the inhabitants of the planet today, Europe had overtaken them in 1850. 7 out of the 10 biggest cities in the world were Asian in 1800. But a century and the Industrial Revolution later, only 1 was still Asian. The growth of the European population, overtaking that of Asia, has been called the Great Divergence. The phenomenon was both demographic and economic and was fed by a variety of factors. It was a dark age for child mortality, with half the children dying before the age of 5, the age at which they would start working in factories in abject conditions. The main killers were dysentery, influenza, plague, smallpox, and typhus, and the epidemics killed large parts of the population. It not only killed the sick, but also the elderly and infants that were dependent for their upkeep by the deceased. Population, however, continued to grow worldwide, increasing from 1750 to 1800 from 700 to 900 million, with an annual growth rate of 0.5%. Both in China and Europe, the population doubled. Slightly higher birth rates, combined with lower mortality rates, contributed to the increase of the population in Europe. Thus, Britain's population grew by 15% in the first half of the 18th century and by 50% in the second half to reach 11 million. It was followed by 100% growth in the first half of the 19th century, with the population reaching 21 million by 1850. Between 1851 and 1855, one-third of the married women in England had at least 7 live births during their lifetime, with 15% having more than 10 live births. Economic output per capita also changed in that period. Europe and the American continent particularly increasing at a remarkable pace. From the year 1000 to 1973, Europe and America's combined output per capita rose from 9% to 51% of world output, while that of Asia decreased during the same period of time, from 67% to 16%. In 1800, the GNP per head was still the same in China and Europe, with, however, 2 countries, Britain and France, starting to grow at a significantly faster pace. If one compares China's and the US's GDP, one notices the widening gap. The US was twice that of China in 1820, 5-fold in 1870, 10 times in 1913, and 33 times in 1968, expressed in purchasing power parity, and 70 times in current dollars. In particular, the Industrial Revolution, fueled by technology, cheap labor, and the practice of working 7 days a week, as well as the unfair trade terms imposed by the European colonial powers, allowed Europe to overtake China and India in their main industry, cotton and silk-based textiles. A very large part of these Asian small-scale industries will simply disappear during the 19th century. Labor in England was significantly more expensive than in the rest of Europe, and perhaps than in the rest of the world. Coal, on the other hand, was significantly cheaper due to its abundance. The possibility of replacing human workers with machines, therefore, made economic sense. In fact, the Industrial Revolution gains to be considered as an agro-industrial revolution that saw vast improvements in all aspects of agriculture, be they crop, livestock varieties, fertilizers, or machinery, increasing yields by up to 10 times. The production of food worldwide is believed to have increased 18-fold between 1750 and 2000. Malthus's theory that population grew faster than food supply was being proved wrong. One should also stress that wealth was more equally distributed in Europe than in Asia, with the consequence that the depth of misery that prevailed in Asia was unknown in Europe. The demographic and economic behavior of ordinary farmers, artisans, and traders led to a system in Europe in which these people could support non-farmers. Europeans also developed a culture of savings. Thus, banking and other financial facilities became available to Europeans, while the Chinese family-owned companies relied essentially on their own resources. Other causes have been proposed to explain the great divergence. Natural disasters and wars. From the 12th to the 15th century, China, and North and Northwest China more particularly, suffered invasions and occupation by the Mongols, among others, civil wars, major floods, and the plague. Europe suffered fewer natural disasters and also had, before Asia, fire-resistant brick and stone buildings. The development of the spur allowed the full domestication of the horse and the rise of the knights, a new class of landowners who introduced technology on their lands. This was particularly true in the northern European plains. Nutrition. Europe witnessed an improvement in the agricultural surfaces used, the yields obtained, and the variety of crops. And as a consequence, there was an improvement in nutrition. The most important improvement was in land clearance, essentially with the use of fire and the use of the axe. Starting in the 17th century, some English landlords introduced new agricultural techniques that allowed them to increase yields, particularly for wheat and rapeseed. From 1700 to 1750, productivity increased by 25%. The introduction of the potato has been reckoned to be responsible for 65% of the growth of the population in the 18th century. Not only did the high disease rate cause malnutrition, and that conversely malnutrition was the cause of a number of diseases, but there was the fact that food production in Europe was, until the middle of the 19th century, insufficient to adequately nourish the lower classes. Malnutrition and related trauma during fetal life and early childhood led to organ dysfunction in later life, and that therefore a better nourished population exhibited less degenerative diseases. It also infers that a healthier organism is better equipped in its fight against pathogens. Dietary improvements, starting in the late 19th century, due to a more plentiful supplies of foodstuffs, led to increased labor force participation by allowing persons previously too undernourished to work to secure employment. For the same reason, intensity of work also increased. Europeans had more heads of livestock, therefore ate more meat and had more draught animals. They had more adequate water resources that they were able to transform into power. The year 1000 saw improvements in the output that could be expected from beasts with harnesses placed on the shoulders of animals and which allowed them to tire less and therefore pull plows with more strength. Animals were also started to be harnessed in line to pull heavier loads. The development of the watermill was also a major technological progress with its ability to transform grain into flour. Other uses were later developed in the metalworking industry, the textile industry, and in wood processing in particular. The watermill was of course followed by the windmill. The crank was another item that contributed to technological progress. All these developments allowed the manor to become an integrated production unit with a large labor force and a trend towards greater efficiency and lower costs. The Industrial Revolution brought a momentous transformation to the continent, transforming its economy from an essentially agricultural one to an industrial system, even though there was a major improvement in agricultural productivity. This led not only to a massive economic growth, but also to the ability of industry to produce goods in massive quantities. Simultaneously, there was an unprecedented growth of the population, from 110 million to 190 million. This allowed the Industrial Revolution to rely on an important labor pool. This growth was essentially fed by the reduction of the mortality rate due to a reduction of infectious diseases and famines, and by the increase in birth rates. This eventually led to the demographic transition with fewer births and a reduced mortality. Reduced smoking, improved nutrition, and increased exercise contributed greatly to improving longevity. The frequent use of soap and the boiling of water was also an important contributing factor. The enclosure movement, regrouping strips of land into larger parcels, was instrumental in the production of larger amounts of food. Markets expanded due to the fact that restrictive legislation, in particular that allowing guilds to impose the rules and conditions, were abolished, and therefore competition allowed for increased market efficiency. Regular, long-distance exchanges of wares in turn encouraged the growth of bills of exchange, a credit system, and banking on an international scale. The very existence of mercantile credit and then bills of insurance pointed to a basic predictability of economic conditions which private traders had hitherto rarely, if ever, enjoyed anywhere in the world. Much of the trade was carried through the roughest waters of the North Sea and the Bay of Biscay, and also because long-range fishing became an important source of nutrient and wealth. Shipwrights were forced to build tough, but rather slow and inelegant vessels capable of carrying large loads and finding their motive power in the winds alone. Although over time they developed more sails and masts and stern rudders, and therefore became more maneuverable, North Sea cogs and their successors may not have appeared as impressive as the lighter craft which plied the shores of the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean, but they were going to possess distinct advantages in the long run. The political and social consequences of this decentralized, largely unsupervised growth of commerce and merchants and ports and markets were the greatest significance. In the first place, there was no way in which such economic developments could be fully suppressed. The basic fact was that there existed no uniform authority in Europe which could effectively halt this commercial development, no central government whose changes in priorities could cause the rise and fall of a particular industry, no systematic and universal plundering of businessmen and entrepreneurs by tax gatherers, which so retarded the economy of Mughal India. The fertility lesson and the sharp increase in child mortality, the fertility boom and the sharp increase in child mortality led to a large immigration boom to the American continent where labor was scarce. Voluntary migration was massive. 60 million people immigrated to America, Australasia, and Africa in the 19th century, and the US is still today one of the preferred destinations of migrants, with over 1 million legal and another 1 million illegal migrants a year entering the country. Latinos represent today 14% of the US population. The flow of migrants has considerably helped America's development. Albert Einstein, for instance, was an immigrant. Control of land by Europeans grew from 35% of the world's emerged land in 1800 to 67% in 1878 and to 84% in 1914. Advances in weaponry were instrumental in this progression. The world's population quadrupled during the 20th century, going from 1.6 billion to 6 billion. In a century, life expectancy doubled from around 30 years to 60. In the 1950s, 156 out of 1,000 children worldwide died before the end of their first year, while 50 years later, the figure had dipped to 57 per 1,000 in the developed countries, equaling to a drop of 85%. The drop was only of 70% in the developing countries. The drop in mortality, however, first affected the adult population, since the first decreases to be treated successfully were those affecting mostly adults rather than children: dysentery, malaria, scurvy, and syphilis. Surgical procedures to deal with difficult pregnancies and gunshot wounds were also substantially improved. The most likely reason that it was progress took place specifically for these pathologies is that the best doctors treated adults rather than children. The major advances in medicine, including tropical medicine, took place in Europe and North America in the 19th and 20th century. The effectiveness of medical intervention, such as vaccination against smallpox, coupled with rising income, thus affordability of these services, was also a major contributor to reduced mortality. The most notable public health improvements are related to water and milk supply, swamp draining, leading to the disappearance of malaria, some slum cleaning, quarantine systems, and the poisoning of rats, thus eradicating bubonic plague. One should also stress the introduction of vaccination against smallpox and the availability of arsenic to poison rats and thus eradicate the bubonic plague. Both increased longevity and increased fertility were also major contributing factors, among other factors such as changes in the marriage institution. While this decline was at first progressive, it accelerated considerably in the second half of the 19th century, so that in the 20th century, the number of deaths in Europe of contagious and infectious diseases was minimal. The consequence has been a sharp increase in life expectancy from an average of below 35 years at the middle of the 19th century to 65 to 70 years a century later. While between 1871 and 1901, life expectancy in Britain increased by 4 years, there was a gain of 16 years in the following 3-year period. It would appear that the Chinese population lived at least as long as did the Europeans, but figures were certainly affected by the high rate, 25%, of female infanticide. The peak of this practice seems to have been reached in the 18th century. From 1945 to 1950, Europe witnessed a very sustained economic growth, and this continued in the following years, making Europe the fastest growing zone worldwide after Japan, whether mentioned by manufacturing output, exports, employment, or disposable income. Although the 1973 oil crisis hit Europe badly, the European community remained the world's largest importer and exporter and had the largest currency and gold reserves. However, from that moment on, production in Europe steadily declined, employment declined, and jobs moved to services, often with substantially lower salaries. Asia's share of worldwide industrial production went from 16% to 30%, partly at the expense of Europe and America, which decreased from 51% to 46%. This process continued, albeit at a lower pace, until the latter part of the 20th century. The European Union has become the world's largest single market, and its currency, the euro, the world's second biggest currency. The level of unemployment, which peaked at 12% in 2013, is now back to 9.5%. However, 40% of the jobs are not permanent positions, and nearly 20% are part-time positions. Youth unemployment remains a major problem. This is partly due to the fact that legislation protects people who have jobs, and therefore corporations are afraid to hire. In spite of all this, many Europeans today share negative feelings towards the European Union, thinking it is just a bureaucratic organization to which they do not relate and whose main purpose is to infringe on people's freedoms with new rules and regulations issued by a distant bureaucracy. They also feel that the European institutions have been unable to adequately respond to the present economic crisis. An important issue that divides Europeans is that of the 1.2 million refugees that have been accepted into the EU, of which 1 million in Germany alone, mostly from Syria, and half of those have been allowed to stay. Needless to say, it is impossible to make projections about the future. Trends, however powerful, can reverse, particularly in the fast-changing world we live in, with new technologies and economic upheavals making substantive modifications in our thoughts and actions. On a shorter time basis, such as 2060, it is easier to make forecasts, and an important one concerns demography. If in 1900 Europe's population was a quarter of the world's, by 2060 that figure will have dropped to 5%, with a consequent drop in GDP. Compounding population decline is the aging factor, with a forecast of a median age of 45 by 2030, thus making Europe the world's oldest region. It seems we can safely say that Europe is dying by suicide, both through the sharp decline in demography and through its attitude to the rest of the world, almost excusing itself for its very existence. If one wants to maintain the present ratio of 4 to 5 active persons for each pensioner, Europe must allow 13 million migrants per year. European governments would want to ideally select them according to the skills needed, but this has proved impossible in view of the influx of refugees. The population movement into Europe, such as in Germany, which has opened its borders to mass immigration, first from Turkey, then Eastern Europe, and now the Middle East, and African refugees, bringing with them a totally foreign culture, are leading to a very different continent, to the point where Europeans sometimes no longer feel at home. The integration that was supposed to take place did not. Simultaneously, Europeans abandoned their culture to create a new one, and many intellectuals believe there is an advantage to a mixed culture. Much of what was loosely called the Western world will not survive this century most probably, and much of it will effectively disappear within our lifetimes, including many, if not most, Western European countries. There will probably still be a geographical area on the map marked as Italy or the Netherlands, probably, just as Istanbul, there is still a building called St. Sophia's Cathedral, but it is not a cathedral. It is merely a designation for a piece of real estate. Likewise, Italy and the Netherlands will merely be designations for a piece of real estate. The design flaw of the secular social democratic state is that it requires a religious society birth rate to sustain it. Post-Christian hyper-rationalism is in the objective sense a lot less rational than Catholicism or Mormonism. Indeed, it is reliance on immigration to ensure its future. The European Union has adopted a 21st century variation on the strategy of the Shakers, who were forbidden from reproducing and thus could increase their numbers only by conversion. The problem is that secondary impulse societies mistake their weaknesses for strengths, or at any rate virtues, and that is why they are proving feeble at dealing with a primal force like Islam. The progressive agenda, lavish social welfare, abortion, secularism, multiculturalism, is collectively the real suicide bomb. The alternative, robots, and more generally artificial intelligence, are not a more comforting solution. In Britain and France, the original migrant population was from the former colonies, and many people thought this was a normal and just situation. Today, however, the national origin of the migrants reaching European shores is totally different. Migration has always been driven by groups of individuals with a specific agenda, whether of fear or hope, which is partly based on economic rationale. Economic migration is the flow of people from poorer countries with high unemployment to countries that are economically better off. Wage differentials between nations is a motivating factor for migration. Increased competition, including economic competition, leading to a disproportionate spread of the wealth in favor of the financial elite in the host country, is another trigger factor for migration, which might in turn free sufficient opportunities for migrants from other countries, migration leading to migration. As salary differentials are established between source and host countries, migration increases. In the 19th century, for instance, salaries in the US were 4 times higher on average than Italian salaries for similar jobs. Migration eventually evens out as salary differentials are reduced. Developing countries may then change from labor exporters to labor importers. However, as salaries in developing countries catch up with those of developed countries, migration tends to increase as there are now resources allowing potential migrants to realize their project. High birth rate in developing countries, accompanied by lack of economic growth to create jobs, will also encourage population flows. Some major migratory waves have led to the introduction of diseases and to the destruction of national cohesion and to the replacement of the elite in the host country, partly because they spread devastatingly mortal diseases. They have also been vectors of technology transfer and more generally of new ideas. Migrants are also more flexible than citizens of the host country and are willing to move from one area to the other as economic conditions change. This is of particular importance today when rapid change in the competitiveness of industries comes about. Occasionally, migrants take major risks to reach the destination, and other groups have organized into armed bands and secured vital assets such as land by force. The 20th century saw huge movements of displaced people as a result of wars, India's partition, the creation of the State of Israel, the rise of Arab nationalism, and decolonization. In the last 10 years of the century, 5 million adults with a tertiary education migrated from developing countries to developed countries, and 2 million adults with a tertiary education migrated from a developed country to another developed country. The number of migrants in the world today, both legal and illegal, is thought to total around 250 million, though many of the figures, even those used by governments, are at best educated guesses. That sounds a lot, but it adds up to only 3% of the world's population. So there is a great potential for growth. Migration has turned out to be a successful strategy for the world's poor to make their lives a little better. Nor is it the very poorest who travel. You need money to move to another part of the world. Thus, as Africa, China, and other emerging countries become less poor, many more people can aspire to travel in search of a better life. People who cross international borders are often categorized by their motives, and some of these categories are seen as less desirable than others. Most migrants move for economic reasons, many in search of jobs, some to be united with relatives. Most appear to be doing so legally. America in 2002 allowed an average of just over 1 million legal immigrants a year who plan to settle permanently, more than half of them sponsored by relatives. Another 320,000 a year entered temporarily. In the 100 years to 1920, prospects of a better life encouraged some 60 million Europeans to uproot themselves and move to the New World. A European who crossed the Atlantic could expect to double his income. Today, the incentives are even more exciting. Those who move from a poor country to a rich one can expect to see their income rise fivefold or more. As long as such differentials persist, the draw will continue. Large-scale immigration into Western Europe is recent. From 1960 to 1973, the number of foreign workers in Western Europe doubled from 3 to 60% of the workforce. It was highest in places like the UK and France, with relatively open access for citizens of the former colonies. In Germany too, the number of foreigners, nearly half of which were Turks, rose to 4 million in the 25 years after 1960, although they seldom became German citizens. However, primary migration into Europe, driven by labor needs, all but ended with the oil crisis of 1973. These days too, demography is playing a big part in migration. Not every migrant is aiming for America or Europe. Perhaps 2 in every 5 move to another poor or middle-income country. But those who go to the richest parts of the world do their inhabitants a favor. Without migrants, the graying and increasingly choosy populations in much of the rich world would already be on the decline today. That matters for the fast-changing economies, which increasingly demand either highly skilled workers or people willing to do unpleasant and tiring jobs. One reason why much of the world has enjoyed a sustained economic boom with low inflation in the past decade is that the effective global workforce is expanding so fast. The IMF says that it has quadrupled since 1980 as China and India have plugged the huge young population into the world economy. It is likely to keep on growing, though at a slower pace, with a 40% increase in the world's working age population forecast by 2050. According to the UN, the global stock of migrants has more than doubled in the past 4 decades. Not enough young natives have the right skills or motivation, so the rich must hope that outsiders will keep coming. And they will. Luckily for Europe and America, there are huge pools of eager workers ready to jump on the next plane, train, or leaking raft to work abroad. Immigration for Africa, for instance, is likely to remain important as standards of living increase and enable inhabitants from the area to acquire qualifications that enable them to immigrate and find a job in the host country. This can be beneficial for their home countries, at least as long as the population is growing fast. The IMF says that immigration from Belize, El Salvador, Guyana, and Jamaica, for example, may have led to higher wages and less poverty. Some Chinese from the heavily populated East Coast are moving out despite a fast-growing economy. Researchers in Africa report a recent rapid inflow of Chinese workers. If exporting brawn generally makes sense for a poor country, sending its better brains away may not. Most, perhaps all, poor and middle-income countries face chronic shortages of skilled workers. In South Africa, although universities churn out graduates at a fast clip, many well-qualified people promptly depart for Britain or Australia, leaving tens of thousands of jobs unfilled at home. Morocco, those with science and engineering degrees, computer skills and languages go to France, the Netherlands, and Canada, whereas the students of literature and public administration stay at home. Professor Mohammed Hashami of Amerm, a migration think tank in Rabat, laments that his country lacks people to build better internet connections, yet Paris now has an association of Moroccan IT engineers. Hospitals and clinics in Southern Africa struggle to cope with huge public health problems as doctors and nurses pack their bags for jobs in the Gulf, Europe, and elsewhere. It is a similar story for schools. It is difficult to draw clear conclusions from the European immigration statistics, as in certain countries there are more migrants than immigrants, while in other countries it is the reverse. Further, some of the migrants and immigrants are nationals of the European Union, and some are immigrating back home. Nevertheless, one can say that in 2015, the last year for which statistics are available, over 1.5 million immigrants entered Germany. However, 350,000 persons left Germany. Corporations in the host countries are delighted to have cheap labor working in their factories, but governments have also to take into account the social services they and their families will require. The problem of integration is a major one, and many immigrants do not integrate, living in a parallel world with little education and therefore few employment perspectives. This is the case even after 3 generations. Since the children of immigrants will be the core of the German population in the future, it does not bode well for the country. Rich countries have taken in more highly skilled migrants than ever before. The World Bank looked at a sample drawn from 52 million migrants in 20 rich countries in 2000 and found that 36 of them had a college education, a sharp rise from a decade earlier. Yet, emigration of skilled workers may be a consequence rather than the cause of problems in the sending country. For example, nurses may be quitting Malawi because the salaries are not being paid or because hospitals are crumbling. Entrepreneurs may be moving abroad because the business climate back home is wretched. Stopping immigration, even if you could, would not solve the problems. The nurses might still leave their jobs. The would-be entrepreneurs might sit on their hands. Indeed, some argue that immigration can help to add to the stock of brain power. More generally, migrants have always brought new ideas and innovation. Many high-tech entrepreneurs in the US are Indians, and the US remains the preferred destination for migrants from less developed countries with a tertiary education, while Asia remains the largest provider of this class of immigrants. A total of 4.5 million students left their home country to study abroad, with Chinese students representing 22% of the total. The preferred destination remains the US and the UK. 1/3 of the doctors in Britain, Ireland, and Switzerland are foreign-born. They have migrated due to a lack of opportunity in their home country due to poorly managed health systems. Inevitably, this means a shortage of doctors in their native countries. China and India has seen large immigration of its graduates, with only 30% or less return. But this may change as the countries pursue their development. In several countries, such as in the Caribbean and in North Africa, over 50% of university graduates emigrate. 83% of Haitians who have completed tertiary education immigrated. Considering that only a small portion of the population of these countries are university graduates, this migration is an important drain on the country's human capital, leading to lower economic and productivity growth. This is particularly true for science, health, and education. Thus, for instance, countries with the highest brain drain of doctors have the lowest per capita number of doctors in their own territory, leading to lower health levels, including higher child mortality. Countries with high migration of tertiary trained nationals also lose tax receipts with which education can be further financed. It also loses the possibility of developing through technology and often rely on the production of natural resources. Migrants usually send money home, and these remittances are often a major contribution to the economy of a developing country and contribute to the fight against poverty. Globally, the amount has now reached $500 billion a year, of which $400 billion to the developing countries, and is certainly larger than the total amount of foreign direct investments, as well as export earnings. Bangladesh is the biggest beneficiary, with up to 44% of all remittances entering that country. Remittances have a number of effects on the recipients. The first is that it reduces the need to work and thus affect local labor markets. It has been suggested that these remittances, which are fairly stable, be used as collateral for long-term loans from the international financial community to the less developed countries. Some migrants accumulate savings so as to return to their home countries, where they will buy a house or establish a business. Very few, if any, of these migrants would have been as successful in their home countries. Some migrants, however, accept jobs below their competences, as there may not be a demand in the host country of these skills. This has been qualified as the brain waste. Statistics show that at least in the US, immigrants are less likely to be criminals than natives. Nevertheless, Policymakers claim the opposite, making it easier and easier to expel immigrants. Migrants who go abroad may spend more time studying, pick up more skills and experience, and then bring them at home again. Remittances are often used to fund schooling, and the prospect of immigration and prosperity abroad may be an inducement for many more to get an education. All this suggests that the consequences of skilled immigration are difficult to calculate, even if they are not negligible. Governments of sending countries would do well to tackle whatever factors are pushing the skilled people out in the first place. Malawi, which exports a lot of nurses, should of course worry that it lacks medical staff. It is said that there are more Malawian nurses in Manchester than back home. But perhaps with donors' help, more investment in public health could be combined with a strategy of training many more nurses than are needed, allowing for future immigration and the other benefits that it brings. Migrants can be tempted back home, even for a short spell, all the better. Ghana, for example, has raised wages for some medical staff and offered incentives to the highest skilled to come back. Money is not the only concern. Staff are also allowed parts of the year to work abroad, giving a boost to their careers. Europe does need migrants as its population ages and diminishes, and that labor is required in working in healthcare in particular. Host countries benefit from migration on a net basis, but in certain sectors of the economy, salaries will fall due to pressure from unqualified migrants. Governments, particularly in host countries, play a key role in the choice of migrants and in the numbers allowed to enter and stay in the country. Europe, for instance, has slowed considerably the flow of migrants, legal or illegal, and this has also been accompanied by a shift to a larger number of women who are allowed to enter, join the husbands who have already settled in the host country, or to marry nationals of the host country. Countries such as Australia and Canada have established policies regarding migration and requesting migrants to have a higher education and speaking the national language. Persons originating from countries with very different cultures are also banned from immigrating. Although the majority of migrants have traditionally been young males with a higher educational attainment than those left in the country of origin, an increasing number of females, estimated at over 200 million, have emigrated. They have also often members of the families, sometimes distant of a few generations, who have immigrated and have become examples of success and will encourage younger members of the families to follow their example. Migration becomes a societal model. It is sometimes the only way for women to attain self-realization, which may be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to attain in their home country. The majority of migrants has at least completed secondary education and leave because there are no education possibilities for them at home, or those that are available are of poor quality. Populist movements in both Europe and the US have taken issue with immigration. Working class people who have lost their jobs, essentially due to the transfer of their industries to emerging or less developed countries, have blamed immigrants for their jobs loss as well as to the loss of national identity, in particular if immigrants speak a different language. However, there is no guarantee that migration will carry on at record rates. It is possible to seal borders tightly enough to keep more people out of those if those inside are ready to pay the price. An earlier period of great migration came to an end, for example, when America, some 90 years ago, shut its door to immigrants for a while. But easier movement of capital and goods has helped to make the world a much richer place in the past decade or two, and more human mobility has both created and helped share it more equally. Billions sent around the world in remittance each year is testimony to that. The price of keeping people out would be high. And unexpected things keep happening. Wars can suddenly displace millions of people who may start off as refugees but end up as migrants. Some people think that climate change might force tens of millions of people to get moving within just a few decades. Misguided policies, a backlash over terrorism, or a failure to integrate migrants could all cause serious problems. All the same, it seems clear 40 years on that Mr. Powell got everything but his sums completely wrong. There is also now a growing presence of immigrants who are not searching for a new home in a new country, but rather who think of themselves as moving in the global labor market. When they are allowed to circulate freely in this way, many prefer to retain a permanent residence in their country of origin and only work a few months in the destination country. Migration is now considered to be a part of the big mobility that sees the free movement of capital and goods and part of the big human network that is spreading through the planet. The Europeans generally have lost faith in the political institutions, and Europe seems to have gone into a decaying process, like previous old civilizations before our time. One of the most important issues has become the change in Europe's ethnic composition. The divide has been between those praising European culture and identity on the one hand, and those praising diversity on the other hand. The position of this last group is based, among other thoughts, on the fact that there is no country in the world that has a homogeneous population and identity due to the various migrations that have occurred over centuries. Diversity assumes that immigrants will want to blend and not maintain their own ethnic profiles. There is also the issue of access to jobs and to public services. The confrontation between these two schools of thought has led those in favor of diversity, to accuse the others of racism. Which of these two schools of thought will prevail? Will Europe die of its own native population, see the death of its own native population, and be replaced by an immigrant population? Will there be a harmonious blend? Thank you very much. What should be the future of Europe? Should Europe become a diverse society that would be propelled forward, but with a probably very different ethnic composition and a very different culture? Or should Europe remain tied to its Judeo-Christian roots and continue having a population decline? Or a third possibility could be for population to pick up again, for people in Europe to want children again, not just one or two, but to increase birth rates and grow with its own internal strengths. Thank you very much.